Hello and a warm welcome to the special panel discussion in the lead up to the World Economic Forum on Africa, set to take place in Durban next week. According to the World Economic Forum Inclusive Growth and Development Report for 2017, South Africa ranks 70th among developing economies on the Inclusive Development Index. South Africa also suffers from extremely high income and wealth inequality. This despite having the 19th highest GDP per capita in this group. Joining me now to unpack just exactly what inclusive growth is and what can be done to bring about impactful change, not only in South Africa, but across our peers in sub-Saharan Africa, is Siyabonga Gama, CEO of Transnet, Dr. Miriam Altman, Strategist at Altman Advisory, Thomas Konditi, Chief Executive Officer of GE in South Africa, and also President and CEO of GE Transportation Africa. Joining us via Skype from New York is Ann Bernstein, Executive Director at the Center for Development and Enterprise. Good to have you with us, and thank you so much for making time. Naturally, it is going to be quite an invigorating conversation as we do set the tone for some of the themes that we hope will be highlighted at the World Economic Forum next week. But keeping in mind that behind us is this board that says time for impact. And again, it goes back to the narrative of effective policies that are often given and provided as a guideline, but of course implementation is what is key and critical to really drive inclusivity within many South African economies. I'd like us to start off by getting your opening comments and opening remarks, just to get an understanding of the lay of the land as things stand. Siyabonga, let's start with you. Where are we lacking within the South African and Pan-African society when it comes to reaching and achieving full inclusion?
Yeah, my guess is that we are all just talk at the moment. We formulated strategies, but the manner and way in which we kind of not get together to say how are we going to implement is really what is holding us back. If you look at South Africa, for instance, I think we all know that monetary policy and fiscal policy alone are not enough in terms of the kind of growth that we require to create economic growth, to move the majority of South Africans from the periphery to the center. What we need to do is to look at the entire ecosystem and say what are the kind of strategies that we need to bring in order for us to be able to create the kind of impact that is required. How do we catalyze economic growth? How do we make sure that both the public and the private sector come together? What is the kind of social contract or compact that is required also with labor and communities? Because it's of no use to sit in one corner to plan when you are not taking all of the people together. So for us, I think it's going to be important that when we talk about the notion and the concept of inclusive growth, we understand what it will take in order for us to move forward. And it's all about bringing everybody together so that we can move. It's not about just moving one cog within the wheel. We have to move all of them.
Exactly, a multi-pronged approach. Miriam, let's get your perspective on the status quo at the moment.
Well, I think we have to get past the status quo. I think we all act in South Africa as though, and in the world, as though we've had growth for a long time, and suddenly we're off the growth path. And the reality is that South Africa has had low per capita growth for 30 to 40 years, with a few years in the 1960s and a few years in the 2000s when there was an acceleration. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is common across Africa. We see the story in Nigeria and many other countries of a minerals economy where people are fighting for resources, groups are fighting for resources, the faces change, but everybody's fighting over resources. There's a lack of investment in people, in basic education, in vocational training, quality of health, competition in markets, and so you don't see the diversification of these economies. So they move in cyclical trends, which means that it's very hard for manufacturing companies and more advanced companies to build.
And that's what we need, diversification of these economies to ensure that they're resilient and can wear the storms that come through the cycles. Thomas, always good to get your perspective with regard to the activity that we see on the rest of the continent. Do you share the sentiments of your colleagues and peers on the panel?
Actually, yes, and I would say that you know, I think a couple of words ring true here. The discussion from Mr. Gama around the ecosystem is it's not just it's not a one trick. It's not government, it's not private sector. There is an ecosystem you have to build that sustains you through the cycles that we're seeing in places that have mineral economies. I think the other reality is we are way behind the curve. Every year there are about 3 million formal jobs created in Africa, and there are 10 to 12 million youths looking for jobs each year. So that's in a good year. Now, what it means for everybody that can create the ecosystem is how do you do it in a way that isn't just status quo or what we tried 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And I think of an inclusive growth curve as something that starts off with jobs. You know, give a job. That's at the bottom of the curve. Move up to SMEs and creating businesses that will create jobs. That's further up the curve. And then you keep moving up to entrepreneurship. SMEs and entrepreneurship are not the exact same thing. An SME can be a cabbage seller, right? Creating some jobs for farming. But an entrepreneur combines ideas, vision, and an opportunity to create, I think, a long-term business. And then finally, you get up into innovation. And how are we innovating? How are we creating completely new zones for us to play in? How are we creating new technologies, ways of using it? So I think that's where the ecosystem demands government for environment, private sector, public sector for stimulus, and then tons of talent and expertise to move us up that curve. That's my view of, you know, if we're going to stop talking and doing, we have to work up that curve.
Exactly. We'll get into that curve and analyze it in just a moment, but we're hearing the multi-pronged approach and various buy-in from a multitude of stakeholders, looking past the waves and looking towards the future when it comes to direction and, of course, the inclusive growth curve. And let's come to you in New York to get your opening remarks and perspective on the current environment in South Africa and across the continent regarding fostering a culture of economic inclusion for many Africans.
Well, I agree with the previous speaker that without growth, we're not going to get any inclusion. And the problem is that people want growth, everyone talks about it, but they don't really want change. So I'm very focused on the priorities we need for reform in order to achieve inclusive growth. And that means we have to have much more labor-intensive economies. We need effective governments that aren't corrupt. And we need to encourage an environment in which investors and businesses want to risk their money. And I think in order to move away from the talk, which everybody wants to do, we have to say, here are my priorities for 2017 or for the next few years. But to just talk in general and assume that all issues are equal doesn't get us very far. So we have a massive challenge in South Africa of unemployment, nearly 9 million people. We're a complete global outlier. And unless we change things, introduce reforms, we're not going to have any impact. So this phrase inclusive growth can mean anything you want it to mean, and people use it in all sorts of different ways. As far as I'm concerned, we need to make the growth process as inclusive as possible, as fast as possible, and we need to make some choices, some tough choices about how to get back to much higher growth rates in South Africa and in many other places on the continent.
I want to bring the conversation back to the desk and this is the part of the conversation where we roll up our sleeves and share ideas and actually hopefully at the end of it all come out with some kind of solution that we can take forward to the conversations that will be held at WEF in Durban next week. And I want to come to you, Miriam. I did forget to mention that you are Commissioner on the National Planning Committee here in South Africa and naturally participated in the development of the National Development Plan. And that goes back to what Ann was alluding to. Some kind of direction, a roadmap to tell us what it is we're doing, where we're going and how exactly we're going to get there. We've got the NDP. Have we managed to implement it efficiently? And bearing in mind that it is a long-term plan, there are a lot of these short-term headwinds that we're facing at the moment, which again tend to see us panic and thrive in uncertainty and almost forget what the end goal is.
Yeah, you know, sometimes there's a psychology that's almost overwhelming that nothing's happening, and it just isn't true. There's a lot that is being delivered. There's a lot that's not being delivered. That's the nature of a big bureaucracy and the change. It's true when you're trying to transform a big company as well. I mean, I've been through that at Telkom. The psychology that I adopt, and we certainly did that when I was working with Sipho Maseko at Telkom, that was the psychology we took. We come into a company that is in a very bad situation 4 years ago, and you think, where do I start in turning this around and getting some acceleration? And what you do is you focus on the things that you know you can change, you've got some power over, and it's no tears. Now, if you take it to the economy, a company is not an economy, but there's a lot of analogies with where we are. So let me just take an example that is true right across Africa, the investment in people. There isn't a chance that this country will grow in a sustained basis, zero chance, if we invest in people this way. So in the diagnostic, we came up with a statistic, which is still true, that 7% of kids who were born in 1990 finished high school with the equivalent of a 50% pass in math and science. That means we're creating a population where the probabilities are stacked against almost everybody. So some people make it through, but that is not a way for sustained growth. I can promise you, we are not moving forward with the nutritional standards, the level at which 3-year-olds in most lower income groups are relative to their richer counterparts, the quality of primary school, the inverted pyramid we have in relation to vocational versus, you know, we produce more university graduates than we produce vocational. Our vocational training isn't practical. That is actually a problem right across Africa.
How do we fix it?
You know, it's not rocket science. That's why I'm saying that, you know, when we talk about growth, it sounds so highfalutin, like you just can't think how you're going to wrap your head around it. If we don't have a pipeline of capable people, it is not rocket science to turn around a vocational system. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's certainly within our power to do. We can't blame global markets on it. We certainly have the resources and are currently investing those resources. And there are plenty of country examples where that intermediate level was strengthened, including the United States and Canada, Ireland, so many countries. Ethiopia has gone forward. A range of countries have made a plan. It's something that's within our power to do.
Mm-hmm. I want us to jump to some of the positives, and as you alluded to, despite all the noise and the environment, at the end of the day, the cogs in the wheel still need to turn, and the wheel still needs to turn to keep the economies going. Are there examples that we can allude to, seeing investment in people, thereafter resulting in investment in small businesses, thereafter resulting in investment in innovation, I think it was that you alluded to, that we see unfolding in South Africa, even if it is from a company perspective like Transnet and GE?
Could I just add a couple of examples? Just to say, so to get away, education's an obvious one. Another example across Africa is that the formal sector, less so in South Africa, but in all these economies, any kind of formal sector that exists tends to be focused on commodities and therefore tends to be very concentrated. So driving small business development and competition through procurement, through giving life to buyer-supplier relations, it's a big policy area in this country. It's been strengthened actually over the Zuma years and Rob Davies. So as much as they get a lot of criticism, that's been a very important area of policy. That needs to get driven across the continent. That's also a source of potential product development, research and development. It's one of the locuses of power that countries in Africa should leverage because they own the resources. And that isn't being given the proper life. I thought maybe it's useful to have something that's related to some of the commercial issues as well.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Maybe just to chip in to give you maybe the Transnet sort of case study. We've got a 300 billion rand market demand strategy, which is an investment-led growth strategy for the country in the logistics space. Part of what we have done in terms of the capital that's available over the next 7 or 10 years is to say, how do we drive industrialization? How do we make sure that we bring in more people? So, for instance, we have a program with GE to assemble locomotives in South Africa. What we've done is we've been able to send people across to the US as part of our supply development and enterprise development perspective. They've been able to come back into South Africa. They supply components into this. Transnet Engineering and GE jointly are working on the manufacture of this. GE supplies some of the kits, but we now have a number of local manufacturers who are giving components into the locomotive. We've created probably about 10,000 jobs within Transnet itself, together with other OEMs. But within the economy, we've created probably a multiple of 7, maybe 70,000 jobs on the one project. But we also have infrastructure projects that are going on. Sometimes we are supporting some of the energy projects that are taking place, because also without energy, you can't just have logistics. You need energy, you need logistics, you need manufacturing, you need the private sector to come in. But I think what we're saying is that let's prevent capital flight out of the country. Let's make sure that we spend here, let's create employment here, but also let's create new industries. So in the same way, for instance, that we have in the automotive sector, we're looking at what is it that we can do in the rolling stock space to create a new industry, not only for South Africa, but also for the African continent. Part of the things that have happened is that South Africa is now designated as the African Union rolling stock base. So we will be looking together with PRASA and also other regional players and other OEMs. How do we create wagons, locomotives, coaches in this country, but for the rest of the African continent?
Exactly. And that's also dives back to the theme regarding access to markets and the development not only of these people, but the businesses, and providing them with markets to tap into. Thomas, I'm not too sure if you wanted to add onto that, as it does take us up on that inclusive growth curve that you alluded to.
It goes to Miriam's point of there may be popular news that says things aren't happening. But if you step back and look over a period of time, I would say it's almost phenomenal to look at where we were maybe 10 years ago to where we are today. I think the program around localization, partnering with Transnet Engineering around the assembly of locomotives, you've moved up the curve. We were at 35%, 34% local content when we first started out about 7 years ago. Today we're at 55% and growing. That 20% is real. It's additional manufacturers in South Africa. And out of the pool that we work with, we actually, 20% of that pool we buy for export. We buy into the GE supply chain outside of South Africa. So that's moving up the curve. You want to move from local production into the quality and capability to compete on the global market. That's South Africa, that's every country if you really want to move up that curve. I think the other part of it is there are some basics that you still have to do. You still have to invest in skills and training. And when you first start, it's difficult. How do I get 100 hours in? Well, if you look now 7, 8 years down the road, we're well past 100,000 hours of skills building, training, travel around the world to learn. So I do think that there's these things tend to now grow on each other. So we're working together on a project to see if we can take some of the technology and growth in South Africa in the rail space. Can we help other countries? We're looking at big economies, Nigeria, other places. Can Transnet and GE do something? Can we bring other partners together and do something that really is not just doing your own work at home, but spreading it around and being really a COE for the continent.
Exactly. I'm happy for us to expand on that as well in a moment. But Anne, I do want to come to you to get your perspective as we make our way up this inclusive growth curve, starting with investment in individuals and, of course, bolstering SMMEs to really become entrepreneurial thinkers. And the top element of that curve that Thomas alluded to being innovation. Just a few years ago, we heard of the fourth industrial revolution being a key theme and phrase being thrown around at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And many say that for Africans, there's a slight disconnect because we still focus on the fundamentals of infrastructure to ensure that our economies are efficient when the rest of the world is having a conversation which is far ahead. Do you believe, and what are your thoughts as well with regard to how we ensure that we touch on all the key points of this particular curve and ensuring that as a continent we don't get left behind whilst investing in our people, but making sure that our people are also able to invest in technology for the...
Let me come back to my theme of some choices. If we're going to improve the skills pipeline, which is vitally necessary, there's some things we have to do. We need to improve our domestic institutions for vocational education. We need to ensure that the relationship between companies like GE, world-class company, and what it needs from our vocational education system is much closer than it has been. We've wasted a lot of money, our institutions are producing people at very low rates, very low throughput, very expensive, and then they're not connected to the world of work. We cannot meet the great demand for increased skills and vocational training only through public sector institutions, which means we should follow India, China, Brazil, and a number of other middle-income countries. South Africa and other African countries should invite private actors to come in and help them train their populations. Of course, you need to sort out the rules of the game and your funding rules so that you can get quality output from both public and private institutions. But that's one of the key choices we need to make if we're going to improve the education and skills pipeline. The second issue, which is not all that popular in Africa, is we need to be much more positive about bringing foreign skills and know-how into our countries. This is not a threat to the domestic population. It's in fact an incredibly easy form of, if you like, foreign direct investment. Some other country has trained people, and we're going to get the benefits of that in our country. So a much more positive attitude to skilled immigration into developed countries in Africa, like South Africa and others, is a second absolutely vital choice that needs to be made and could get very quick returns.
From a South African perspective, perhaps we do see that talent exchange taking place at a high level within more larger institutions. But if you're speaking to Jabulani, who's in Alexandra Township, that's a different mindset to kind of implement there. Are there themes that we need to explore to ensure that the message does get down to the average citizen who is hungry, who needs to pay their bills at the end of the day, who needs to take their children to school at the end of the day? I know it's a rather tough dynamic to actually unpack, but at the end of the day, these are the individuals who we might potentially employ within our organizations and become leaders and captains of industry in particular sectors.
Maybe if I can comment on that, because as a multinational, by definition, we're in a lot of different countries, and we train in every country. So I look at my South African employees as a company just as important as my Turkish employees, my Russian, my U.S. employees. And so with that investment in all those different people, it would be crazy for me to say I'm going to keep all my South African employees in South Africa. I'm not going to take them anywhere else. And by the same virtue, if I have a skill set and an expertise that is needed in South Africa, I want to be able to move somebody from Turkey, from the US, from the UK to come and help develop. But I think it's incumbent upon it doesn't just work one way. If you bring foreign talent in, it's very easy simply to rely on that foreign talent, and then eventually they have to go home. And then you're left with what? And that's the part where the connectivity between succession planning, between training, between mentors, mentorship programs, it has to happen, and I think that's something we've seen probably stronger in South Africa than maybe anywhere else. But I think the other part of it is that you know, one of my favorite countries to travel through is Dubai, or cities is Dubai. Not because of the airline and the airports, but because you look at the pictures on the wall in the Dubai airport, and look at 50 years ago when it was a strip. It was sand, you had a fishing village effectively, but somebody had a vision that said, bring in external talent that knows what they're doing, create a tax environment, a living environment, a safety environment that lets them practice, and see what happens. You go there today and you're talking, you know, 1,500 hotels. You know, I don't know if we have 1,500 hotels in Africa in total, but in one city, it's moved in 40 years where I really wish, you know, 50 of our cities could do the same. So I think that's one where it does pay off if you structure it right.
And you did have some commentary that you wanted to provide as feedback with regard to the theme. Feel free to unpack it further.
Yes, I want to respond, Gugu, to your points about what does this mean for Mr. Dlamini and Alex. Well, there are a number of issues. The first is that to advocate much more open, skilled migration into South Africa and other developing countries is not to let countries off the hook in improving their own skills pipeline. That's absolutely vital. That's number one. Number two, countries that are more open to immigration grow faster. So you can create more jobs for people in Alex and elsewhere. And I think that how you manage this situation is by effective political and civic leadership. So we don't wait for terrible xenophobic outbursts where criminals and other people who are desperate get involved in horrific incidents. You need to manage this issue that people who come to South Africa with skills, who can teach maths in our schools, who can manage projects, who prepare to risk their money in investing in factories, these people will create jobs for South Africans. And we're not doing that very effectively, and we're losing out on a very important tool to drive much faster growth. So how a country manages its migration policy is absolutely vital. It's complex in many societies, but we're not doing this well. And if you look at Silicon Valley, or you look at Albania, I was at a conference last week in Harvard where there's evidence of the importance of migrant skills in helping to drive a country like Albania, never mind Silicon Valley, where nearly half of the high-tech companies that are driving the world economy, never mind the American economy, have been started by immigrants. And if you have a policy that keeps those people out of your country, developing countries will never get the know-how that's available to them from the rest of the world.
I think we might create a conception here that maybe South Africa or Africa does not accept immigrants. I don't think that's a correct...
Otherwise, both Miriam and Thomas wouldn't be sitting here today, right?
That's correct, yeah. I don't think that's a correct conception. In fact, I think South Africa prides itself as probably the African capital, Johannesburg in particular, as probably the African capital in terms of labor migration of talented individuals from around the world who come in and use South Africa as a gateway into the rest of the African continent. I think the discussion that we've been having is what type of skills do you want to bring in? When you have high unemployment in the country itself, you cannot bring everybody. You need to bring people with unique skills who are going to assist us, but also at the same time we make sure that we create the kind of environment where we educate, where we transfer skills, so that we don't have an over-dependence on expatriate skills, but we also make sure that we create the kind of base within South Africa itself to learn from the people who come through. So for me, I don't even think that it is a matter that merits too much discussion, because it would create the impression that it's not happening. It is happening. There is a lot of things, I think, in terms of reform that we need to look at, and I think we need to reform our hearts and minds as well, because when we talk about the kind of investments that we need to make to stimulate economic growth, sometimes we look at the immediate. We look at there's been a credit downgrade, but in that credit downgrade, maybe there's an opportunity for us to plant a seed today which might grow in 3 years' time. And therefore, we must not be myopic in the manner in which we do things. We've complained that a lot of our private sector entities, they sit with a pile of cash on their balance sheets. When in fact, because growth is always cyclical. So if there is very low economic growth at this point, it is going to come up at a point. Maybe we should be saying, how do we structurally reform the economies, move away from commodity-based and raw material-based economies? How can we smelter more things? We now have more energy from Eskom, the stability, for instance, and there's also other energy mixes. So we need to be saying, what else should we be doing to stimulate economic growth, to create those jobs, but also begin to enter into some of the higher order industries like digitalization, for instance. There is nothing wrong with being in the middle of the second, the third, and also the fourth industrial revolution, so that because there are different skills that people have in the economy, and as we diversify that economy, we will need all of the skills. So all factors of production are important. Entrepreneurship is important. Innovation, R&D, critical in order for us to create new industries. How many new industries have we created in South Africa in the past 20 years? These are the questions that we should ask, and then begin to say, where are the gaps and what is it that we need to do?
Well, we will certainly build up on these particular themes that have been highlighted, and actually picking up on the themes that have been discussed, the focus on innovation, regional integration as well, because as a continent, we all need to progress going forward together, ensuring that, again, even from a continental perspective, that there is full inclusion of all participants. That is what we'll touch on shortly after this quick break. Welcome back. You're still joining us for our conversation as we prepare for the World Economic Forum, which is set to take place in Durban next week. And joining us for our conversation on inclusive growth as well as time to make impact that is tangible is Siyabonga Gama, CEO of Transnet, Dr. Miriam Altman, strategist at Altman Advisory, Thomas Konditi, Chief Executive Officer of GE in South Africa and President and CEO of GE Transportation Africa. Via Skype, we have from New York, Ann Bernstein, Executive Director at the Center for Development and Enterprise. Now, before in this first half of the conversation, we focus certainly quite a bit on skills development, because fundamentally human resources is the most important investment that one will ever make when it comes to cultivating a culture and economic prospects in your company as well as countries. But I want us to tie it back into the upper level of the inclusion or inclusive curve. I think that's how we referred to it earlier on today, regarding tapping into innovation. And you've got some interesting views as well, Miriam, with regard to how, as Siyabonga alluded to, there's no problem being actually in the various cycles of development, where they still focus on infrastructure development as well as the fourth industrial revolution. But South Africa and Africa overall has an opportunity to tap into technological advancements and learnings from its peers in the international landscape, and bringing them closer to home and customizing them to aid our development going forward.
So, fourth industrial revolution sounds a little abstract, but if we bring it home, it's possible to leapfrog certain industries. So, as an example, the National Development Plan says we should create about 700,000 jobs in IT-enabled services. Now, South Africa has a leading financial sector, leading capability around business services, but very small IT-enabled services because we're not stoking the trade aspect of that industry. So that's an example where we could be using international trade, international demand out of the US, the UK, Europe, even spillovers from India and China, and we're simply not stoking it the way that other countries have. If I can say by comparison, India created 2 million jobs over a decade in IT-enabled services, and that is not call centers, that is diversified industrial capability in back office services. Now, we tend to think of services as something that just happens on top of other stuff. These are industries that have their own niches now, technology, capabilities, they're traded, and it's our choice to take advantage of that or not to. And that's true in other parts of Africa as well.
I want us to pick up on that because we always think of it as a futuristic concept and theme, but it's actually happening in the now. And it's today and it's current. And even for entities like GE and even Transnet, who through their investments and opportunities identified on the continent, tap into this as well. It's not just a matter of moving goods and services on the railway services that you have, right, Mr. Gama? But technology is alive right now.
Yeah, in fact, we've got an interesting joint venture between Transnet and GE, which looks at the digital space, where we're looking at asset management in particular to say, in this age of the Internet of Things and where we move a lot of data, how could we begin to assist other entities within the African continent in terms of becoming much more efficient, so that we could promote the competitiveness of the logistics space, where they can use existing assets in order for them to optimize on what they already have, you know, as a precursor to further industrialization and further capital investments that might be required. So there's a lot of good work, I think, that is taking place, and we can learn very quickly. And I think at the moment, I think education is now without borders. You don't need to reinvent the wheel because there are innovators who are continuously doing something either in Bangalore or somewhere in California, in the Silicon Valley. And these things, they come together pretty quickly at this point in time. So there's a lot that we can learn from each other, and there's a lot of platforms that are being created around innovation.
You mentioned something so important, and that's getting rid of the borders, and that takes us to the overriding objective of the World Economic Forum on Africa, is that it's not just a South African view, a Rwandan view, a Tanzanian view, but it's understanding how all these major economies can move forward going together. From your experience and some of the projects that you've implemented as Transnet, are we seeing a positive change taking place with regard to the dynamics regarding regional integration and regional dynamics to move these entities and the continent forward using technology as well as the skills and services that are available from a cross-border perspective? I'm happy to get your view, and then we'll go to Ann shortly.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think also as co-chair of the World Economic Forum in Africa next week, part of what we want to achieve is how could we make sure that there is better intra-African trade. We only really trade amongst ourselves as Africans about 17% of the available trade. So there's still a lot of things that we need to do. There's still a lot of connections, either through infrastructure or through regional integration, whether it's within the maritime sector or the railway or the road. So there's a lot of conversation and discussion in terms of saying, as Africans, how can we improve and how can we trade with each other more? How can we look at some of the customs processes, for instance, and have paperless documentation? How do we deal with clogging at some of our borders? So there's a great conversation in terms of how to move Africa forward, because that is an important aspect. So we don't want to meet at the World Economic Forum only to network, but it's really to say, how do we shape a new agenda? How do we shape a new conversation that takes us forward, and that we can go back you know, to subsequent fora and say, this is what we discussed in 2017, this is what has been achieved as a result of that engagement between ourselves.
And to get your perspective on this particular theme, you've got a commentary to add?
Look, I'm obviously in favor of innovation, and I'm in favor of much greater trade between African countries and getting rid of the barriers to that. But if we're going to come back to inclusive growth, we have to talk about low-skilled jobs, because through no fault of their own, many millions of people in South Africa and in the continent do not have experience and do not have a decent education. And so the big challenge, if you want to talk about inclusion, is how do we create jobs for people who have never had jobs before? And that, luckily, doesn't require innovation. And developing countries can build on the experience elsewhere to get involved in activities that don't require new ways of doing things or all sorts of innovative things that I'm in favor of. But if you're looking at how we're going to provide inclusion for these millions of people who are excluded, and not just more and more for the insiders who have jobs, we have to focus on the something like 80 to 90 million jobs that are moving out of China in low-skill factories, and how we can create the environment in which some of those factories will come to South Africa and other African countries. Ethiopia is ahead of the game. They've created an export footwear industry with Chinese investors. South Africa, we need to get into this market. And we have both domestic investors and we can attract international investors, but we're not doing that. So it's not that I'm ignoring the progress that has been made, but if we're serious about inclusion, we need to talk much more about all the people who are not part of the modern economy.
And I'd like to get your views as we build up on this theme. As you say, job creation is quite critical and ensuring that it's jobs that are easy for people to gain access to. But how do we address giving people jobs with also ensuring that they not only have jobs for the current environment, which make them relevant to the local economy that they work in, but also globally competitive, which again ties back to the initial theme that we did hear from Miriam regarding technological services and companies to help aid and support skills development. So are there tangible suggestions that you can provide regarding how to grasp both these particular concepts and bring them together for sustainable job creation, not just for the short term and locally effective, but also globally relevant and globally competitive jobs for the future?
Not all factories are being automated. Some are, but certainly a lot of low-skilled textile and other factories are not being automated. And the world's best experts are saying this isn't going to happen for 10, 15 years. So there's lots we can do that's appropriate to the level of skill of our population. Secondly, South Africa, for example, has to work incredibly hard now to get an investment grade that's absolutely vital to get growth going again. And I don't think it helps to try and ignore the reality that this country is in deep, deep trouble, and that has consequences for the rest of the subcontinent. So we've gone backwards in South Africa in many respects, and we're not going to move off a stagnant growth rate unless the country takes some tough decisions to get us back to investment grade and start getting a much higher growth rate that is akin to what the National Development Plan has argued for. It's no good talking about the National Development Plan and we're nowhere near that growth rate. Of course, the higher parts of our economy, the more sophisticated parts, need all of this, but they also need the kinds of skills to innovate. And that's where my point about fix the domestic education and skills pipeline, which requires some tough choices about performance management. And at the same time, bring in the skills that we don't have. And Mr. Gama and I disagree about the facts, because although some big companies are able to bring in some skills, the economy needs lots and lots and lots of skills. And the truth is, over the last 10, 15 years, we've kind of been losing skills.
You mentioned something quite critical, that Ethiopia is beating South Africa from a manufacturing perspective with its shoe manufacturing facilities. So that obviously brings up the question as to how a small or rather larger economies can actually learn from their smaller brother counterparts. And Miriam, you want to say something?
About how they're beating us on manufacturing and get some reality base here? Because I also hear about how Rwanda and Kenya is beating us on telecommunications.
Yes,
have you ever tried to connect to people who are there? It's not so easy. So they've made inroads, they've moved ahead, there's no doubt. But let's hammer ourselves on the right stuff. We just attracted a very significant auto manufacturing investment from China into Kucha recently, multi-billion-dollar investment, and that is not a unique story. So I think that is a kind of production that is appropriate for our level development. What we don't want to do is attract investments that aren't sustainable for our level development and our cost structure. The more labor-intensive, lower technology kinds of production are appropriately located in Ethiopia, Kenya, and so on, because they've got the right kind of cost structure and so on. We should be attracting products that are higher up the value chain, like the auto manufacturing and similar. We're also much more of a services economy, and we need to leverage that, and that creates a lot more jobs. Most jobs globally are created in services, and we need to think about how we make those services more dynamic and more traded, so that wages can rise and the economy can move forward. I think just to say one more thing, just if I can just add, because we're talking about WEF, and I'll stop. We have to think about Africa trade and investment, and I'm sure you're going to raise that. We have to be thinking about how South Africa, as the most industrialized country, is driving as a pivotal state within the region trade and investment, so that we're getting in agriculture, in other sectors, that we're doing the higher value activities and more knowledge intensive activities, and that we're stoking production in the region. If we don't do that, again, we're going nowhere. I'm sure that's what you were going to come in on.
No, I just wanted to agree with Miriam that what's also important, I don't think as countries on the continent, we need to be looking at ourselves as potentially competing against one another.
Sure.
But I think we could complement one another in terms of different types of skills. For instance, in South Africa, we've got the Industrial Development Zone programs in Saldanha, in Kucha, Richards Bay, and other places. But also, there are incentives for foreign direct investment that are being made by the Department of Trade and Industry into particular niche industries that South Africa wants to participate in. So we are not going to be the end and be for everything. For instance, what we're looking at the mining sectors. We're looking at the oceans economy. Operation Pakisa is an important aspect where we think, for instance, we could create about 1 million jobs. How do we bolster SMMEs through the industrialization program? How do we make sure that there's more people who come in and participate through supplier development? So there are specific things that, as South Africa, we have a particular comparative advantage. And we need to therefore work much more in terms of building onto our strengths as a country, while also making sure that it's going to be important that in each and every country there's inclusive growth, because you can't keep too many people on the periphery of the economy and not include them and think that there will be no polarization. So it's going to be very important that whatever we do, we think much more about how communities are going to be involved, how people in rural areas are going to be involved. There's a lot of urban migration that happens on the continent. How do we make sure that we create industries in rural areas so that people can stay at home and create jobs from there, and we create more opportunities where they are.
Makes sense. So using these unique strategies and working to our strengths as various African economies in order to derive the sufficient investment opportunities there. I do know Anne has some feedback, but Thomas, you've been quiet for quite a while and you have some comment to share.
No, I think first of all, let's focus on the E in WEF. Yeah. Okay, because that's really, at the end of the day, what you're trying to measure. And I think what I think we've seen in South Africa is what gets measured gets managed. Yeah. And I think tying a couple of themes together, if you want to have more inclusive growth, you should look at how are you including other countries in your growth. And this is not all about South Africa including other countries, but if I were to take a measurement at this WEF and then come back in a year or two from now and say, please tell me, how in your country, how many new players from other African countries have set up a business in your country, and how many jobs have they created? Because that's the untapped. That's the part that says that there's a guy that knows how to do something in Kenya, that if he employed the same techniques in Malawi or in Zimbabwe or in Ghana, you would have job growth. And I think it ties back to this whole discussion of, are you generating jobs? Are you taking jobs? Or are you generating business and creating business? And so if I were to look at who you're bringing into South Africa, into another country, I'd say, by all means, if you're coming from country X, please come, but tell me how many jobs you're going to create. And then you're more than welcome. And I think if you measure that year over year, that intra-Africa discussion becomes more real. 10 jobs created for the guy in Alex is that's a job in Alex, regardless of who did it. So I think it also means that when you're investing in also sectors that need that investment. I would take a space, or in terms of inclusiveness, women. How many women do we have participating in economic activity, economic growth, technological, innovative growth? GE kicked off a few months ago a focus on how do I get 20,000 women into engineering and technology by 2020. Our chairman's measuring us on that, which means we're all out there looking for our share of 20,000. It's the same discussion for a WEF group. We can talk, what are we going to measure? And then when I come back next year, how do we compare?
Mm-hmm. We do have about 5 minutes left to start drawing up on our closing remarks, but I do know, Anne, you had some feedback that you wanted to provide with regard to the discussion, but allude to that as well as concluding and giving us your concluding views as to what needs to be put at the table at WEF Africa come Durban with regard to seeing and making a tangible impact regarding inclusion in the continent.
I think the key issue, if we're serious about the phrase inclusive growth, is to answer this question. What are we providing the population we have now in terms of work? In other words, South Africa and other African countries have to create jobs for the workforce they actually have, not the highly skilled one they wish they had. I wish we had that too, but we don't. We have millions and millions of people who have never worked before and through no fault of their own have come out of a terrible education system. That's partly why we have to be looking at creating much more labor-intensive economies, not to the exclusion of the high-tech parts of the economy, but if we are to be inclusive within a country, you have to have more labor intensity. And we can go on and on about all sorts of other things, but the fact is, unless South Africa changes, we're going to continue to have one of the largest unemployment sort of proportions of our population in the world. So that's the reality and the facts that we're dealing with, and it's how we do that. What are the key issues that we need to wrestle with and take choices about that are different from what we've been doing up till now? It's not that everything we've been doing has been terrible, but we have to do things differently if the subcontinent's most important economy is going to start growing again. And I don't think we can keep reverting back to what we've been doing in the past. So I'm advocating taking inclusion seriously. That means more labor-intensive kinds of production. And that is going to involve some tough choices about reform. And we're not going to get growth unless we start doing things differently.
Thomas, let's come to you to get your closing remarks as to some of the themes and ideals that need to be addressed to ensure that we do see impact taking place regarding inclusion going forward.
So I think number one is do what you're good at. And I think, you know, it's been alluded to here is if you know how to do something, do that as much as you can to affect the end objectives. Multinationals have certain things that they're good at doing. Leverage them to do things like skills transfer, like replowing some of their investments in spaces that you want, either communities or education systems or what have you. And then I think the other part of it is partnership. You know, it's not by chance that you have a GE and a Transnet looking at opportunities in Nigeria. It's because they bring capabilities that make that work. Not by chance that we're looking at digital applications. So I would say that you look at the strengths, that's what you leverage, and then you just say, look, here's what I'm going to measure you on. And I think you see the results, but you have to begin to measure it.
Measure the results and the outcome. Miriam, very briefly, your closing remarks as to what needs to be put on the table?
I think we need to get down to basics, which is getting an affordable cost of living. That's an issue across Africa. Having competition in markets, leveraging procurement of large mines and large companies that are in those countries, getting broadband expanded to promote the fourth industrial revolution, which I think is a very great idea for Africa to reduce our geography challenges. And overall, just having clear rules of the game. I think that's our problem right now. It doesn't necessarily matter exactly what they are, but investors need to know what they are so they can plan ahead.
Siyabonga, your closing remarks and views.
Yeah, no, I think Africa is really at the precipice of some very great things that are likely to happen, because I think as we strengthen institutions, we make sure that the regulatory frameworks are appropriate and correct, and we have a political leadership across the continent that has a vision of an integrated planning and development framework in terms of creating a far bigger market of more than 1 million Africans. And then saying, how do we then take all of that together and say, improve intra-African trade, look at telecoms and see what are the possibilities in terms of broadband. We also look at energy. We need to light up Africa. We need to create more energy. We need more roads. We need more railways. We need more ports. But also importantly, we need to make sure that we invest in the young people, especially in the science and technology and mathematics space, so that we can then have the possibility to create new inventors. We have a young man, for instance, who's got a planet named after him here in South Africa. Those are the kinds of people like Siyabonga that we want to have. So the STEM projects are quite critical. So we need to make sure that we then get multinationals, private sector, SOCs to invest in the education and the future for our country.
Exactly. Quite a multi-pronged approach that is clearly being reflected by our panelists today regarding how we can really achieve impactful inclusion on the African continent from an economic perspective. Well, that does bring us to the end of this discussion and a special interview for today. A big thank you to my panelists, Siyabonga Gama, CEO of Transnet, Dr. Miriam Altman, Strategist at Altman Advisory, Thomas Konditi, CEO of GE in South Africa, and also President and CEO of GE Transportation Africa. Not forgetting Ann Bernstein, Executive Director for the Center for Development and Enterprise, joining us via Skype from New York. From myself, Gugulethu, Cele, and the team, that's where we leave it for now, but keep the conversation going regarding the World Economic Forum Africa on 410.